In the year 2001, a crown prince walked into a family dinner with a rifle, a shotgun, and a submachine gun, and in the space of a few minutes wiped out almost his entire royal bloodline. He then shot himself in the head and was crowned king 3 days later, while lying brain-dead in a coma. That is not a legend. That happened in this century. There are people alive right now who watched it on the news. And it is only one of the ways a royal family can vanish from history. Because for every dynasty you know, the Windsors waving from the balcony, the crowns and the carriages, there are dozens you've never heard of. Families that ruled for centuries. Families that owned entire countries, that were worshipped as living gods, that seemed as permanent as the mountains. And then they were gone. Erased so completely that most people today don't even know their names. Some were murdered. Some were locked away and forgotten. One little boy king was left to rot alone in a stone tower until his own heart was cut out and passed around Europe for 200 years. One queen was overthrown by fruit salesmen. One emperor tore the crown off his own head so that no one would ever find his body. Today, we're going to walk through the strangest, saddest, and most unbelievable stories of the royal families who simply vanished from history. And I promise you, by the end of this, you will never look at a crown the same way again. So settle in. This one goes to some dark places. Let's start with that prince and the dinner party, because it's the most recent, and in some ways, it's the most disturbing of all. Nepal in the year 2001 was a kingdom out of a storybook, tucked into the Himalayas, ruled by a royal family that the people didn't just respect, they literally worshipped. The king of Nepal wasn't only a king. In the eyes of many of his subjects, he was a living incarnation of the god Vishnu, a god on earth. You didn't just salute this man, you bowed to him the way you'd bow to heaven. The king was Birendra, a gentle, Western-educated man who had given up much of his own absolute power to let Nepal become a democracy. His people loved him for it, and his heir was his eldest son, Crown Prince Dipendra. And on paper, Dipendra was the perfect prince. He'd been educated at Eton, the elite English boarding school that produces British princes and prime ministers. He'd trained at Sandhurst, the Royal Military Academy. He was charming, athletic, popular. The golden boy, the future. But Dipendra had a problem, and the problem was love. He had fallen for a woman named Devyani Rana, beautiful, wealthy, sophisticated, and completely unacceptable to his mother, Queen Aishwarya. Because Devyani came from the Rana family, a clan that had been the historic rivals of the royal Shahs for generations. And there were whispers about her bloodline, about a grandmother who hadn't been of high enough birth. To the queen, this woman was simply not good enough to be the future queen of Nepal. So the queen said no, and she didn't just say no. According to the accounts, she threatened her son. Marry this woman, and you can forget the throne. We'll pass you over. We'll give the crown to your younger brother instead. Imagine that pressure. The most eligible man in the country, worshipped as a future god, told he can have the throne or he can have the woman he loves, but not both. And the woman he loves, according to some accounts, told him she'd only marry him if he became king. He was trapped between his mother and his heart, and the walls were closing in. On the 1st of June 2001, the royal family gathered for their regular Friday dinner party at the Narayanhedi Palace. It was a routine event, a family get-together. Security was strangely light that night, and one senior royal, the king's brother, Prince Gyanendra, happened to be out of town. Remember that. People in Nepal certainly did. Dipendra had been drinking heavily. By some accounts, he was so drunk that other family members had to help him to his room earlier in the evening. And then he came back. But he didn't come back as a prince. He came back dressed in camouflage military fatigues, and he was carrying an arsenal, a submachine gun, an assault rifle, a shotgun, a pistol, enough firepower for a small war, and he opened fire on his own family. He shot his father, the king, the living god, first. Then he turned the guns on everyone else, his mother, the queen, his younger brother, his sister, aunts, uncles, cousins. In a few minutes of gunfire in that palace dining room, the Crown Prince of Nepal murdered 9 members of his own family and wounded several more. It was the worst massacre of a royal family since the Romanovs were shot in that Russian basement in 1918, and this one was committed by the heir to the throne himself. Then Dipendra walked out to the palace garden, put a gun to his own head, and pulled the trigger. But here's the detail that makes this story almost too strange to believe. He didn't die, not right away. The bullet didn't kill him. It put him into a deep coma. And under Nepalese law, with the king dead, the crown passed automatically to the next in line, which was Dipendra. So the man who had just slaughtered his entire family was declared the new king of Nepal, while he lay unconscious in a hospital bed, brain dead, kept alive by machines, having just murdered the previous king with his own hands. For 3 days, Nepal had a king who was a mass murderer in a coma, who would never wake up, who would never know he was king. The newspapers called him the Ghost King, a monarch who ruled a nation without ever opening his eyes. 3 days later, Dipendra died, and the crown passed to his uncle, Prince Gyanendra, the very man who had conveniently been out of town that night. You can imagine what the people of Nepal thought about that. To this day, huge numbers of Nepalese simply refuse to believe the official story. They cannot accept that their beloved prince, the god's own son, murdered his family over a woman. The theories have never stopped, that it was a conspiracy, that Gyanendra was behind it, that the golden boy was framed. There's a haunting detail that fuels it. During the massacre, Dipendra reportedly had his uncle's son, Paras, right in front of him, and didn't shoot. The one branch of the family that survived intact was the branch that took the throne, and the strange details pile up the closer you look. The official inquiry ruled Dipendra's death a suicide, but Dipendra was right-handed, and the fatal bullet went through his left temple. Some who study the case have quietly wondered whether a military aid finished him, or whether the suicide story papers over something messier. Why was security so light that night? Why was the one surviving senior royal conveniently abroad? The investigation was rushed. The crime scene was reportedly cleaned before it could be properly examined, and the 2 men who could have explained everything, the king and the crown prince, were both dead within days. For a country that worshipped its royal family, it was as if the heavens themselves had cracked open. One American diplomat in Nepal at the time put it plainly. The Nepalese people viewed the king as a god, literally a god, and they had just watched that god be gunned down by his own son. We may never know the full truth, but we know the ending. Gyanendra took the crown, and he was a disaster. He grabbed back the absolute power his brother had given away. The people who had worshipped the monarchy for centuries turned against it with astonishing speed. And in 2008, just 7 years after that dinner party, Nepal abolished the monarchy entirely. The 240-year-old Shah dynasty, a family the people had literally believed were gods, was voted out of existence and told to leave the palace like ordinary citizens. They didn't fall to an invading army. They didn't lose a great war. A single night of gunfire at a family dinner, born out of a mother's disapproval and a son's broken heart, brought down a dynasty that had ruled for centuries. That is how fast a royal family can vanish, in the time it takes to eat dinner. But at least we know the Shahs existed. At least their story is remembered. The next family I want to tell you about ruled one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen for over 1,000 years, and today most people can't even tell you their name. Picture the most powerful empire on earth. Not a country, an empire, one that has stood for 1,000 years. One so grand that its capital city is considered the center of the civilized world, a city of gold and marble and towering domes that travelers wrote about in awe. This was the Byzantine Empire, the surviving eastern half of the Roman Empire, the direct continuation of the empire of Julius Caesar and Augustus. When Rome itself fell in the west, this empire carried on in the east for another 1,000 years. 1,000 years. And the family that ruled it in the end was called the Palaiologos dynasty. Say it with me, Palaiologos. Remember it, because by the end of this, you'll understand why almost nobody does. In the spring of 1453, the young Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, he was only 21 years old, but ferociously intelligent and obsessed since boyhood with taking this one city, brought an army of tens of thousands to the walls of Constantinople. And he brought something else, something the world had never seen before. He brought the largest cannon ever built. Here's a detail that tells you everything about how empires die. The man who built that cannon was a Hungarian engineer named Orban, and Orban had actually gone to the Byzantines first. He offered his monster gun to Emperor Constantine to defend the city. But Constantine was broke. The empire was so poor by then that the emperor simply could not afford to pay him. So Orban walked across the lines and offered the same cannon to the Sultan instead, who paid him whatever he asked. The weapon that would shatter the walls of Constantinople had been offered to its defenders first, and they were too poor to buy it. The empire was destroyed by a gun it could have owned. And what a gun! This cannon, nicknamed the Basilica, was around 27 feet long. It could hurl a stone ball weighing 600 pounds, the weight of a grand piano, over a mile through the air. It was so enormous, it had to be dragged to the city by 60 oxen and hundreds of men. When it fired, the roar could be heard for miles, and it could bring down chunks of ancient wall that had stood for 1,000 years. But even that wasn't enough at first, because the walls of Constantinople were the most formidable in the world, and the defenders were incredibly brave. Every day, the great cannons smashed the walls, and every night, by torchlight, the exhausted defenders rebuilt them, packing the gaps with earth and timber and barrels of soil, a desperate race between cannon and shovel. For weeks, against all odds, the shovels kept winning. The city had one more advantage too, a gigantic iron chain stretched across the mouth of the harbor that physically blocked the Ottoman fleet from getting in. So Mehmed did something that still sounds impossible. If he couldn't sail his ships past the chain, he'd go over land. In a single night, he had his men build a greased wooden road over the hills, and they dragged dozens of warships up out of the water, across the land, over the hills, and back down into the harbor on the other side of the chain. The people of Constantinople woke up to find an entire enemy fleet floating inside their protected harbor, where no ship should have been able to reach. Ships on the hills. It broke their spirit. And the man who held that crown at the very end was Constantine XI. He was the last emperor of Rome. Let that sink in. A line of emperors that ran all the way back to ancient Rome. And this one man was the final link in the chain. The last Caesar. He had barely a few thousand men to defend miles of wall against an army of tens of thousands. It was hopeless. Everyone knew it was hopeless. The Sultan even offered him a deal: surrender the city, and you can leave alive, keep your life, keep your family, rule some small territory somewhere. Just hand over Constantinople. Constantine said no. He had decided he would die with his city. On the final night, before the last assault, he went to the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, one of the most beautiful buildings ever constructed by human hands. And he took communion. He said goodbye to the people around him. He asked forgiveness of everyone he had ever wronged. Witnesses said grown men wept. And then he went to the walls to wait for the end. When the final Ottoman assault came at dawn, the walls were breached. The defenders were overwhelmed. And here is the moment that turned Constantine from an emperor into a legend. As the enemy poured into the city, the last Roman emperor did something extraordinary. He tore off his imperial regalia, the purple robes, the eagles, the ornaments that marked him as emperor, and he threw them to the ground. He didn't want to be recognized. He didn't want to be captured, paraded, humiliated. He wanted to die as an ordinary soldier, anonymous, so that no enemy could ever hold up the body of the Roman emperor as a trophy. And then he drew his sword and charged into the oncoming army, and he was never seen again. His body was never found, not for certain. The Sultan's men searched through the piles of the dead, looking for the emperor, and they could not identify him. He had vanished into the chaos so completely that to this day, nobody knows exactly how or where Constantine XI died. The last emperor of Rome simply disappeared into the fall of his own city. And that mystery gave birth to one of the most beautiful legends in history. The Greeks called it the legend of the Marble Emperor. They said that at the last moment, an angel swept down, rescued Constantine, turned him into marble, and hid him in a secret cave beneath the city. And there he sleeps, frozen in stone, waiting. And one day, he will wake and rise and take back the city and restore the empire. For centuries, Greeks passed this story down, generation to generation. Some believe it even now. But the real ending of the Palaiologos family is not a beautiful legend. It's something much sadder and stranger. Because the dynasty didn't quite die with Constantine on those walls. He had brothers and nephews who escaped. And what they did with the last claim to the Roman Empire is one of the most pathetic footnotes in all of history. Constantine's nephew, a man named Andreas, inherited the family's claim to the throne of the Roman Empire, the title of emperor, the greatest title in the Western world. And Andreas, living in exile in Rome, broke and desperate for money, did the unthinkable. He sold it. He sold the title of Roman Emperor to the King of France. And then, apparently, he sold it again to the King of Spain. He peddled the crown of the Caesars like a man hawking a second-hand watch, cashing in the same priceless inheritance to two different buyers because he needed the money. And another of the family, Constantine's other nephew, did something even more darkly ironic. He gave up. He traveled to Constantinople, the city his uncle had died defending, and he went to the court of Mehmed the Conqueror, the very sultan who had destroyed the empire, and he sold his rights back to him, the heir of the Roman emperors, going cap in hand to the man who killed the empire, trading away his birthright for a comfortable pension. That is how the Palaiologos dynasty really ended, not with the marble emperor sleeping in his cave, waiting to return, but with his nephews selling the crown of Rome to the highest bidder, until there was nothing left to sell, and the family faded into the crowd and disappeared. A 1,000-year empire and its last heirs auctioned it off for pocket money. No wonder almost nobody remembers their name. Now, the Byzantines were destroyed by an empire from the outside. But halfway across the world, at almost exactly the same moment in history, another mighty royal dynasty was about to be wiped out by an enemy it didn't even understand. Men who arrived on floating islands, wrapped in metal, riding animals no one had ever seen. And this story has a twist you won't see coming. In the early 1500s, the most powerful empire in the entire Western Hemisphere was the Aztec Empire. Its capital, Tenochtitlan, was a breathtaking city built on an island in the middle of a lake, laced with canals and causeways, home to as many as 200,000 people, bigger than almost any city in Europe at the time. The Spanish soldiers who first saw it said it looked like an enchanted vision, like something out of a dream. And at the head of this empire sat one of the most powerful men on earth, the Emperor Moctezuma II. Anglicized, you probably know the name as Montezuma. Moctezuma ruled millions. He was treated as semi-divine. Servants swept the ground before him so his feet wouldn't touch the bare earth, and no one was permitted to look him directly in the eye. He lived in staggering luxury, with palaces, gardens, even a private zoo. His empire seemed as eternal and unshakable as any on the planet. And then, in 1519, a few hundred Spanish adventurers, led by a man named Hernán Cortés, landed on the coast, and within 2 years, it was all over. What happened between Moctezuma and Cortés is one of history's great tragedies and one of its great mysteries. The Spanish were welcomed into the capital as guests, and then, somehow, the guests took the emperor prisoner inside his own city, in his own palace. Moctezuma became a captive puppet in the hands of a few hundred foreigners, and his death in 1520 is still argued about 500 years later. The Spanish claimed that Moctezuma went out to calm his angry people and was stoned to death by his own subjects, who felt he had betrayed them. Others say the Spanish simply murdered him when he was no longer useful. One account even claims the proud emperor, humiliated and broken, refused to eat and starved himself to death rather than live as a prisoner. However it happened, the 9th emperor of the Aztecs died a captive, and within a year, his glittering island capital had fallen, its people slaughtered by Spanish steel and European disease. The Aztec Empire, the great power of the Americas, simply ceased to exist. But here is the twist. Because unlike almost every other family in this video, the bloodline of Moctezuma did not vanish. It survived, by climbing into bed with the very people who destroyed it. Moctezuma had many children. Historical sources suggest around 19. Most died in the chaos of the conquest. But one daughter changed everything. Her name was Tecuichpochtli, and after the conquest, she was baptized a Christian and renamed Isabel Moctezuma. And Isabel did something remarkable. She survived by marrying, over and over, straight into the new order. She was married 5 times, twice to Aztec emperors, her own relatives, and 3 times to Spaniards. She even had a daughter out of wedlock with Hernán Cortés himself, the conqueror of her people, the man responsible for her father's downfall. And the Spanish crown, rather than erasing Moctezuma's line, decided it was more useful to co-opt it. Isabel was recognized as her father's legitimate heir. She was granted vast lands and estates, becoming one of the wealthiest women in the new colony. Moctezuma's descendants converted to Christianity, took Spanish names and Spanish titles, and were absorbed into the nobility of the empire that had conquered them. The blood of the Aztec god-emperor kept flowing, but now it flowed through Spanish counts and Mexican aristocrats. It gets stranger. The Spanish crown actually began paying Moctezuma's descendants a pension, a regular payment, essentially rent, in exchange for the royal lands the family had given up. A Moctezuma pension. And this payment continued for centuries. Generation after generation of the emperor's descendants collected money from the Spanish crown, and later the Mexican state, right up until the year 1934, when post-revolutionary Mexico finally scrapped it. There are people alive today whose grandparents remember the family collecting the Moctezuma pension. Some descendants have gone to court, trying to get it reinstated. And here's the detail that really lands it. In Spain, to this very day, there exists a nobleman who holds the title Duke of Moctezuma, a real, current, official title of the Spanish nobility, one of the highest ranks there is, held by a direct descendant of the Aztec emperor who died a prisoner 5 centuries ago. The empire is gone. Tenochtitlan is buried under Mexico City. The gods are forgotten, the language nearly lost. But somewhere in Spain, a duke still carries the name of Moctezuma. The empire vanished completely, and the bloodline quietly became European aristocracy. That is a stranger fate in its own way than simply dying out. The family survived by dissolving into the world that killed it, until the Aztec emperor became a line in a Spanish nobility register. Now, so far, we've stayed in the distant past. But the next family to vanish involves a child. a little boy who inherited a throne and got a stone tower and a lonely death instead. And his story stayed a mystery for 200 years, until scientists cut open a jar and tested what was inside. His name was Louis Charles, and he was born a Prince of France in 1785 into the most glittering court in the world, Versailles. Gold everywhere, fountains, silk, 10,000 candles. His mother was Marie Antoinette. Yes, that Marie Antoinette. His father was King Louis XVI of France. This little boy was born into the absolute peak of royal luxury on planet Earth. He was a happy child, by all accounts. Bright, affectionate, adored by his parents. And when his older brother died, little Louis Charles became the Dauphin, the heir to the throne of France. One day, this cheerful little boy would be king. His future could not have looked brighter. And then the entire world caught fire. The French Revolution. You know the broad strokes. The people rose up against the monarchy. The royal family was arrested. And in 1793, Louis Charles' father, the king, was marched to the guillotine in front of a roaring crowd and beheaded. And the moment that blade fell, something strange and terrible happened. That little boy, 8 years old, sitting in a prison cell, automatically, instantly, became King Louis XVII of France. The King of France, a child, a prisoner, a king with no kingdom, no crown, no freedom, a king in a cage. Because the revolutionaries had a problem now. As long as this boy was alive, he was a rallying point. Royalists across Europe recognized him as the true King of France. He was dangerous simply by existing, so they had to make sure he could never become a symbol. What they did to him is genuinely hard to talk about. They took the little boy away from his mother. Marie Antoinette fought them. She physically resisted, clinging to her son for nearly an hour before they tore him from her arms. It was the last time she ever saw him. And then they handed the child king to a man named Antoine Simon, a cobbler, a shoemaker, and a hardened revolutionary given one job: to erase the prince out of the boy, to make Louis forget he had ever been royal. And the methods, by the accounts that come down to us, were vicious. Simon taught the little boy to curse, to swear in the language of the gutter. He got the child drunk on wine again and again for entertainment. He taught him crude revolutionary songs and made him sing them, made the son of the King of France sing songs mocking his own executed father, songs celebrating the guillotine. This was a small boy, 7, 8 years old, being systematically broken and remade into a jeering little revolutionary who spat on his own name. And then they used him to kill his mother. While Marie Antoinette awaited her own trial, they took her son, confused, manipulated, worn down, and they got him to sign a statement making monstrous, unspeakable sexual accusations against his own mom. Accusations of incest. And they read that child's testimony aloud at Marie Antoinette's trial and used it to help send her to the guillotine. Imagine that. They broke an 8-year-old, put words in his mouth, and used those words to behead his mother. When Marie Antoinette went to the scaffold, one of the last wounds she carried was that her own little boy had been turned into a weapon against her. And then they locked him away in the Temple Tower to be forgotten on purpose. A grim, dark, medieval prison in the heart of Paris. They put him in a small, cramped room and simply let the world move on without him. His jailers were told to keep him alive but to give him nothing. No kindness, no education, barely any human contact. For long stretches, he was completely alone, a small child sealed in a stone room, hearing nothing, seeing no one, spoken to by no one. The neglect was monstrous. The boy who had grown up in the palace of Versailles, surrounded by servants and silk, was left to sit in his own filth. He developed sores, tumors. He stopped speaking. He wasted away in the dark, this child king, month after month after month, and nobody came. Nobody helped. It is one of the loneliest deaths in the history of royalty, A 10-year-old boy, the King of France, dying by slow neglect in a black stone room, forgotten by the world. Officially, Louis XVII died in that tower in June of 1795 at the age of 10, most likely of tuberculosis made fatal by the abuse and neglect. But here is where the story becomes a 200-year mystery, because almost nobody believed the official story. There was no proper grave, no monument. The body was buried quickly and quietly, and immediately the rumors began. Some said he'd been murdered outright. Others whispered something far more tantalizing, that loyal royalists had smuggled the real prince out of the tower, hidden him away, and left a dying peasant boy in his place. That the true King of France was alive, out there somewhere, waiting to reclaim his throne. And just like with the Romanovs and their Anastasia impostors, the pretenders came crawling out of the woodwork. For decades, men appeared all across Europe and even in America, each claiming to be the lost King of France, the boy who escaped the tower. One claimant was a clockmaker in Germany. Another was a missionary living among Native American tribes in Wisconsin. There are places in America to this day named after the lost Dauphin because of him. Dozens of men insisted they were the miracle child who got away. Some of them believed it so completely they passed the claim down to their own children. The mystery lasted 200 years, and it was finally solved by the strangest piece of evidence you could imagine: a heart in a jar. Because when the boy in the tower died, a doctor performing the autopsy did something that was a tradition for French royalty. He secretly cut out the child's heart and smuggled it away, preserving it as a relic. And that little heart went on an incredible journey. It was stolen, hidden, passed from hand to hand, submerged in alcohol that slowly evaporated until the heart mummified into something hard as wood. For 2 centuries, this shriveled little organ sat in a crystal jar, and no one could say for certain whose heart it was. Then, in the year 2000, scientists finally tested it. They took DNA from the mummified heart, and they compared it to DNA from a lock of Marie Antoinette's hair, saved from when she was a girl and from her living relatives. And the answer came back clear. The heart belonged to a boy who was, without question, a child of Marie Antoinette's bloodline. The lost Dauphin never escaped. There was no miracle, no smuggled prince, no rightful king wandering America. The little boy really did die alone in that stone tower, exactly as the sad official story said. Every single impostor across 200 years had been a liar or a fantasist. And in 2004, that tiny withered heart was finally carried in a solemn ceremony to the burial place of the kings of France and laid to rest beside his ancestors, the only part of the boy king ever to make it home. That's the thing about vanished royalty. Sometimes an entire life comes down to a heart in a jar and a 200-year question. But that little boy at least died in the country he was born in. This next royal family was overthrown in something far more recent, and it happened on American soil. The United States government has actually apologized for making it happen. When you think of Hawaii, you probably think of beaches, surfing, volcanoes, the 50th state. But not that long ago, within the lifetime of your great-grandparents, Hawaii was not part of the United States at all. It was an independent kingdom, a real kingdom, with a real royal family, palaces, a throne, crowns, the whole thing. The only royal palace on American soil that was ever home to a reigning monarch is sitting in Honolulu right now. And the story of how that kingdom vanished is one that a lot of Americans have never been told. The last monarch of Hawaii was a queen. Her name was Liliuokalani, and she was a remarkable woman. She was intelligent, deeply cultured, and genuinely gifted. She was a composer, a songwriter who wrote over 100 songs. If you've ever heard the beautiful Hawaiian farewell song, Aloha Oe, that was written by the last queen of Hawaii. This was not some idle royal. This was an accomplished, serious woman who loved her people and her islands with her whole heart. And that love is exactly what got her overthrown. Because by the late 1800s, Hawaii had a problem, and the problem was sugar. The islands were perfect for growing sugarcane, and over the decades, a class of wealthy American and European businessmen, many of them the sons of missionaries, had come to Hawaii and gotten very, very rich off sugar plantations. And these businessmen had slowly, steadily been taking power away from the Hawaiian monarchy. A few years before Liliuokalani took the throne, they had forced the previous king to sign what became known as the Bayonet Constitution, called that because he signed it under the threat of armed force. It stripped the monarchy of most of its power, and, critically, it stripped most native Hawaiians of their right to vote, while giving power to wealthy foreigners. When Liliuokalani became queen, she wanted to fix this. She wanted to write a new constitution, one that gave power back to the crown, and above all, gave the vote back to her own people, the native Hawaiians, in their own homeland. That was her crime. She wanted Hawaiians to be able to vote in Hawaii. The sugar businessmen could not allow it. If the queen restored power to native Hawaiians, their control was finished. So a small group of them, mostly American and European businessmen, only a handful of them actually Hawaiian, formed what they grandly called the Committee of Safety, and they staged a coup. And here's the part that should stop you cold. They were backed by United States Marines. American troops from a warship in the harbor came ashore, supposedly to protect American lives and property, and their presence made the coup unstoppable. In January of 1893, they surrounded the palace, declared the monarchy abolished, and demanded the queen step down. And Queen Liliuokalani faced an impossible choice. She could order her small royal guard to fight and watch her people be slaughtered by American Marines in a hopeless battle. Or she could surrender to save their lives. She surrendered. But listen to how she did it, because it tells you everything about her. She yielded her authority, but not to the businessmen. She yielded it, she said, to the United States of America itself, trusting that once the American government learned what its agents had done in its name, it would undo this injustice and restore her to her throne. She surrendered under protest, betting everything on the honor of the United States. That bet did not pay off. One of the coup leaders, a man named Sanford Dole, and yes, that is the Dole name you know from the Pineapple and Fruit Company, his cousin founded it, installed himself as president of a new government. The Queen's kingdom was gone, and then it got worse for her. 2 years later, some of her loyal supporters attempted an armed uprising to put her back on the throne. It failed, and the new government used it as an excuse to come after the Queen herself. They arrested her. They put the Queen of Hawaii on trial in her own palace, and they imprisoned her in an upstairs room of that very palace, the beautiful Iolani Palace she had once ruled from. And they told her that if she did not formally, permanently abdicate, give up the throne forever, they would execute her supporters. The men who had risen up for her would be put to death. So to save their lives, she signed. The last Queen of Hawaii, a prisoner in her own palace, signed away her crown and her kingdom to save her people from the gallows. But before that, they put her on trial, and where they held that trial is almost too cruel to believe. They tried the Queen of Hawaii in her own former throne room, the very room where she had received ambassadors and held court as a sovereign, now turned into a military courtroom where she was convicted of treason against the people who had stolen her throne. And then they locked her upstairs in a corner bedroom of her own palace for 8 months. They frosted the glass on the windows so she couldn't see out and no one could see her. She was allowed no visitors except a single lady-in-waiting. No newspapers. No news of the outside world at all. The woman who had ruled the islands was sealed in a single room in the middle of her own home, cut off from everything. And here is what she did with those 8 months. Two things, and both of them will stay with you. First, she kept writing music. Locked in that room, she composed songs. Songs about freedom, about her people, about her hopes for Hawaii. And her loyal supporters found a way to smuggle those songs out to the world. They hid them in the wrapping paper. When bouquets of flowers were brought to the imprisoned queen, her prison songs were slipped out concealed in the paper that wrapped the next bunch of flowers. Her music escaped the prison, hidden in flower wrappings, and reached her people on the outside. And second, she made a quilt. Together with her one companion, the imprisoned queen sewed an enormous quilt, and she used it to do something extraordinary. She stitched her own overthrow into the fabric. She embroidered the dates right into the cloth. The day her kingdom was stolen, the day she was forced to step down, the day of the failed uprising, the day of her imprisonment. When she was forbidden from speaking, forbidden from newspapers, forbidden from telling anyone what had been done to her, she recorded the death of her kingdom in thread, one stitch at a time, so that it could never be erased. That quilt still exists today. It hangs in the very room where she was imprisoned. You can go and see the crime documented in embroidery by the queen who lived it. In 1898, the United States formally annexed Hawaii. The kingdom was gone for good. Liliuokalani lived out the rest of her life as a private citizen in the islands she had once ruled as queen, watching the country she loved become someone else's territory. She died in 1917. The Hawaiian monarchy died with her. Now here's the epilogue that most people don't know. A full century later, in 1993, the government of the United States did something almost unheard of. Congress passed, and the president signed, an official apology, a formal, legal apology to the native people of Hawaii for the overthrow of their kingdom. The United States government admitted, in writing, that its own agents had helped illegally overthrow a peaceful sovereign nation and its queen, and that the Hawaiian people had never agreed to give up their independence. The queen who surrendered under protest, trusting that America would one day recognize the wrong that was done. She was right. It just took 100 years, and she didn't live to see it. A whole kingdom, a whole royal line vanished, not in some distant medieval war, but in living memory, in America, over sugar. Now, Hawaii's royals lost a kingdom, but the next family lost something even bigger. They didn't just rule an empire, they were the spiritual leaders of an entire world religion, and they were given 72 hours to pack a suitcase and disappear forever. For 600 years, the Ottoman dynasty ruled one of the most powerful empires the world has ever known. Founded around the year 1299 by a warrior named Osman, the family that took his name, the Osmanoglu, the sons of Osman, built an empire that, at its peak, stretched across 3 continents. They controlled southeastern Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. They ruled the great city of Constantinople after conquering it from those last Byzantine emperors we talked about earlier. For 6 centuries, the Ottoman Sultan was one of the most powerful human beings alive, and they held something even greater than an empire. Starting in the 1500s, the Ottoman sultans also claimed the title of caliph, the successor to the Prophet Muhammad, the spiritual leader of the entire Muslim world. Think about the weight of that. This wasn't just a king. To hundreds of millions of Muslims across the globe, the Ottoman Sultan was the closest thing on earth to a supreme religious authority. God's deputy, the leader of the faithful everywhere. They had held that sacred role for over 400 years. 600 years as emperors. 400 years as the spiritual heads of a world religion. If any dynasty on earth seemed truly eternal, truly untouchable, it was this one. And then, over the course of a single day, it was over. The Ottoman Empire had been dying slowly for a century, losing territory, losing wars, and it was finished off by defeat in the First World War. Out of the wreckage rose a new leader, the general Mustafa Kemal, who would become known as Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey. and Ataturk had no use for sultans or caliphs. He was building a modern republic, and to him, the ancient royal family was a relic that had to go. He abolished the sultanate first in 1922. The last sultan quietly slipped out of the country on a British warship, and that was that. But the family still held the title of caliph, the religious one, the sacred one. And in March of 1924, Ataturk's government moved to erase that too. On the 3rd of March, the Turkish parliament abolished the caliphate entirely, and they didn't stop there. In the same stroke, they passed a law stripping every single member of the Ottoman imperial family of their citizenship and ordering them all, every prince, every princess, every last one, out of the country. Exiled. Forever. They were forbidden from even setting foot in Turkey again, forbidden to pass through in transit. The law gave them, in some cases, as little as 24 hours to be gone. Imagine it. 156 members of a 600-year-old dynasty, people who had lived their entire lives behind the marble walls of palaces on the Bosphorus, waited on by armies of servants, suddenly told they had a day, maybe two, to abandon their homeland and never return. To understand how far these people fell, consider one princess named Neslisha. When she was born, just 3 years before the exile, cannons were fired across the empire to celebrate. Commemorative coins were struck in her name, and her birth was entered in the official palace register as an event of state. She was, quite literally, born to the sound of celebratory cannon fire. 3 years later, she was a stateless refugee carried out of the country in her family's arms. Born a princess honored with cannons, a toddler in exile before she could even remember the palace. Many of these people had never traveled anywhere alone. The women of the imperial family, raised inside the palaces, had never cooked a meal in their lives. Many had never handled money, never held a coin, never paid for anything. They had no idea how the ordinary world even worked, and now they were being marched to a train station with whatever they could carry, handed passports that would be valid for exactly 1 year, and pushed out into a world they were completely unequipped to survive in. The last caliph, a gentle, artistic man named Abdulmecid, who painted landscapes and played the cello, was hustled out so fast and so quietly that they didn't even dare send him from the main station in Istanbul for fear of crowds and demonstrations. They put him on a train at a small station outside the city and sent him off on the Orient Express into permanent exile. From his exile, he wrote to a friend and quoted Shakespeare, Hamlet, describing himself as suffering the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. The spiritual leader of the world's Muslims, the successor to the Prophet, reduced to quoting a heartbroken Danish prince from an English play, alone in a rented room in France. And there's a small, haunting detail from that departure. As the last spiritual leader of the Ottoman world left his homeland forever, the last person to show him respect on Turkish soil, the last human being to bow to the descendant of Osman, was reportedly the Jewish director of that little train station. One quiet man, bowing to a fallen emperor as history shut the door behind him. And then came the fall. Because the family was told to sell everything, their palaces, their art, their heirlooms, 6 centuries of accumulated treasure, within a year, or the state would simply seize it all. So they sold in a panic for almost nothing. Priceless antiques went for pennies. And some of them, desperate and naive, handed their valuables to trusted friends for safekeeping, friends who simply kept everything and vanished. The family that had ruled 3 continents was robbed on its way out the door. They scattered across the world, France, Switzerland, the United States, the Middle East, and they fell into genuine poverty. Princesses who had grown up in palaces ended up in tiny apartments, struggling to pay rent. Some of them, quite literally, not knowing how to cook their own food or manage their own money. Members of one of the oldest and grandest dynasties in human history died poor and forgotten in foreign cities, far from the empire their ancestors had built. The last sultan died in exile in Italy. The last caliph died in a Paris apartment during the Second World War. The exile was so total that Turkey didn't allow the women of the family to even visit their homeland again until 1951, nearly 30 years later. The men weren't allowed back until 1973, nearly 50 years of banishment for the crime of having been born into the wrong family. 600 years of empire, 400 years as the leaders of a world faith ended not with a battle, but with a bureaucrat's signature and a one-way train ticket. That's how fast eternity ends. Now, that brings me to the last family I want you to meet. And of all these stories, hers might break your heart the most. Because she didn't lose a war or a throne or a crown in some grand political drama. She lost her mind and her home and her name, slowly, over a lifetime, as a hostage in a foreign country. Her name was Deoki, and she was the last princess of Korea. For over 500 years, Korea was ruled by the Joseon dynasty, one of the longest-lasting royal houses in the entire history of the world. 5 centuries of kings and queens, of palaces and traditions, of a culture as refined and ancient as any on earth. And at the very end of that long story, in 1912, a baby girl was born in a Seoul palace. Princess Deoki, the youngest daughter of the Korean emperor, born when her father was already an old man in his 60s, and her father adored her. She was the light of his old age, the beloved late-life daughter, doted on and treasured. There are photographs of her as a tiny girl, and she looks like exactly what she was, a cherished little princess in a golden palace. But she was born at the worst possible moment. Because just 2 years before her birth, in 1910, Korea had been swallowed by the Empire of Japan. Korea was no longer independent. It was a colony, and the Korean royal family was no longer a ruling family. They were essentially prisoners of the Japanese Empire, kept in comfort but stripped of all real power, useful only as symbols to be controlled. While her beloved father was alive, Deoki was protected. She lived a sheltered, happy early childhood in the palace. But her father died when she was still a young girl, some say under suspicious circumstances, and with his death, her protection vanished. And the Japanese authorities turned their attention to the little princess. They saw her as a problem. Deoki was popular. The Korean people loved her. She was the last symbol of their vanished independence, the living reminder of the kingdom they'd lost. And a popular symbol of Korean identity was exactly what the Japanese Empire wanted to erase. So they did what empires do with inconvenient royalty. They took her away. At the age of 13, Princess Deoki was sent to Japan, supposedly to be educated, but in reality as a hostage. Torn from her homeland, from her language, from her people, and planted in the country that had conquered hers. She went to live near her older brother, the Crown Prince, who had been taken to Japan years earlier for exactly the same reason. A royal hostage held to keep the Korean people in line. He was, technically, the King of Korea, a king without a country, without a crown, a prisoner attending a Japanese military school. He couldn't even help himself, let alone his little sister. And Deoki began to break. Alone in a foreign land, cut off from everything she knew, watched constantly, unable to go home. Her mind began to give way. The symptoms started slowly, sleepwalking, then forgetting to eat, forgetting to drink, then worse. She was eventually diagnosed with a serious mental illness. Some accounts point to schizophrenia. The homesickness and the isolation and the grief had quite literally driven the last princess of Korea out of her own mind. And Japan wasn't finished arranging her life. They forced her into a marriage, to a Japanese count, a man from a family that had once ruled a small island. It was a political marriage, designed to further absorb her into Japan and erase her Korean identity. She had a daughter, but her illness deepened. Her marriage fell apart. And then came perhaps the most crushing blow of all. Her only daughter, her child, left a note hinting she was going to take her own life, and then vanished, never to be confirmed found. Deoki's husband placed her in a mental institution, and there she stayed, for years, and then more years. Think about the shape of this life. A cherished princess, born in a palace, adored by an emperor. And then, her country erased, her father dead, taken hostage as a child, driven mad by exile, forced into a marriage, her daughter gone, and finally locked away in a foreign asylum and forgotten. The Korean people had largely lost track of her. For decades, most of her own countrymen didn't even know if the last princess was alive or dead. She had simply disappeared. A living person, erased from the memory of her own nation. And here is the part that will stay with you. After nearly 40 years, 38 years away from home, she was finally, quietly allowed to return to Korea. In 1962, an old, frail, mentally shattered woman was helped down the steps of an airplane in Seoul, surrounded by reporters. She had left as a beloved 13-year-old princess. She came back a broken woman of 50, her mind clouded, barely able to speak. But something beautiful happened at that airport. Waiting for her were her old court ladies, the women who had served her when she was a little girl in the palace half a century before. They were old women now, too, and when they saw their princess coming home at last, after all those years, they fell to the ground and wept and bowed to her, the way they had when she was small. They had never forgotten her. To them, she was still their princess. She had never stopped being royalty, not for one single day of all those terrible years. Deoki lived out her final years back in Korea, in a quiet corner of one of the old royal palaces, the last home of the last members of a 500-year dynasty. Her mind came and went, and near the end of her life, in a rare moment of clarity, the last princess of Korea managed to write down a few words about everything she had lost. She wrote, "I missed my motherland even while I was in my country." Read that again. "I missed my motherland even while I was in my country." She had finally come home, and home wasn't there anymore. The Korea she'd been torn from as a child, the kingdom, the palace, the world of her father, all of it had vanished while she was gone. She was a princess of a country that no longer existed. She died in 1989, and with her last breath, the 500-year-old Joseon dynasty of Korea, one of the longest reigning royal families in the history of the human race, quietly came to an end. No massacre, no dramatic last stand, just a lonely old woman in a palace, remembering a home that was gone. That's how a 5-century dynasty vanished. Not with a bang, with a whisper. So let's sit with all of this for a minute, because when you line these stories up next to each other, something starts to come clear. A prince in Nepal, worshipped as a living god, who wiped out his family at a dinner party over a broken heart. An emperor of Rome who tore off his crown and vanished into the fall of his city rather than be captured. An Aztec god emperor who died a prisoner whose bloodline survived by marrying into the men who destroyed it, until it became a Spanish dukedom. A little boy king left to die alone in a black stone tower, his heart cut out and passed around for 200 years. A gifted queen in Hawaii, overthrown by sugar barons and imprisoned in her own palace, writing songs while her kingdom was stolen. A 600-year Ottoman dynasty, the spiritual leaders of a world religion, given a day to pack and pushed onto a train into poverty. And a Korean princess driven mad in exile, who came home after 40 years to a country that had disappeared while she was gone. 7 families, 7 corners of the world, 5 centuries between the oldest story and the newest. And every single one of them ruled with total confidence that their line would go on forever. That's the thing about royalty. It's built on the idea of permanence. The whole point of a dynasty is that it doesn't end. The crown passes from father to son to grandson, on and on, world without end. Kings genuinely believed they were chosen by God. The Nepalese thought their king was a god. The Ottomans thought their sultan was God's own deputy on earth. The Hawaiians and the Koreans traced their lines back through centuries. These people were as certain of their permanence as we are certain the sun will rise tomorrow. And it meant nothing. The God King's dynasty lasted 7 years past that dinner. The 1,000-year Roman Empire ended with 2 nephews selling the crown for pocket money. The 600-year Ottoman dynasty ended with princesses who couldn't boil an egg dying broke in foreign cities. The 500-year Korean dynasty ended with a sad old woman's whisper. Not one of these families saw it coming. Not one of them believed, until it was actually happening, that they could possibly be the ones to vanish. And I think that's really why these stories grab us and don't let go. It's not just the crowns and the palaces and the drama, although that's part of it. It's the reminder buried inside every one of them that nothing is permanent. Not power, not wealth, not worship, not 1,000 years of history. That the mighty fall exactly as hard as everyone else, and sometimes harder, because they have so much further to fall. That a family can go from being worshipped as gods to being erased from memory in the space of a single lifetime, sometimes a single night. There's an old saying that history is written by the victors, but that's not quite the whole truth. History isn't just written by the winners, it's forgotten by everyone else. These families didn't just lose their thrones. Most of them lost their place in our memory entirely. How many people do you know who could tell you the name Palaiologos, or Osmanoglu, or Deokie, or Liliuokalani? These were emperors and empresses, queens and kings and caliphs. They ruled millions of people. Some of them were worshipped as gods on earth. And today, they're footnotes, if they're remembered at all, a duke's title in a Spanish register, a heart in a jar, a song on the radio that nobody knows a queen once wrote in a prison cell. Maybe that's the real vanishing, not the loss of the throne, the loss of being remembered. So the next time you see a royal family on television, the waving, the jewels, the carriages, all that certainty and grandeur and permanence, maybe spare a thought for the ones who had all of that too, and are gone now. The God King of Nepal, the last Caesar who threw down his crown, the boy who died in the tower, the queen who wrote songs in her prison, the caliph on the midnight train, the princess who missed her country while she was standing inside it. They all thought it would last forever. It never does. And that, in the end, might be the only thing about royalty that's truly permanent. The fact that sooner or later, every single crown is set down, and every dynasty, no matter how mighty, finally vanishes from history. The only question that's ever really up for grabs is whether anyone will remember they were there at all.